What if the greatest conqueror of the ancient world was never meant to be a man at all, but a child of the gods? Imagine this: a young prince born under a storm that split the heavens, whose mother swore that lightning itself had touched her womb. His father, a king of Macedonia, began to suspect that perhaps the boy who would soon rule the known world was not truly his son. The whispers spread. Was Alexander, the future great, nothing less than divine? Or was it all a carefully woven myth, designed to make men bow before him without question? For centuries, historians, poets, and rulers have argued over this mystery. Was his so-called divine birthright a truth the world dared not challenge, or a weapon of propaganda sharper than any sword? Stay with me, because in this story, fact and legend clash like armies on the battlefield. And by the end, you'll have to decide for yourself. Was Alexander destined by Olympus, or crafted by ambition? This is not just history. This is a riddle that has haunted empires. And tonight we are going to solve it together. So, are you ready to uncover the truth? Part 1. The Birth of a Legend. The story begins not on the battlefield but in the quiet chambers of a queen. Olympias, a woman of fire and shadows, wife to King Philip II of Macedon. To the world she was merely the queen. But in whispers she was a priestess, a dreamer, a woman whose blood burned with the mysteries of the old gods. She claimed that her lineage reached back to Achilles himself, the hero of the Trojan War. A claim that tied her womb not to the mortal world but to destiny. One night, as storms raged over Pella, the capital of Macedon, Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt striking her body. When she awoke, she swore that something divine had entered her. And not long after, she carried within her the child who would one day be called Alexander. But was this vision a tale born from truth, or carefully crafted mythology? Philip himself was haunted by dreams. One in particular stood out. He dreamed he sealed his wife's womb with the image of a lion. Interpreters whispered it meant she would bear a son fierce as a lion, destined to rule. Philip took it as a sign, but in his heart, a question lingered. Did this son belong to him, or to Zeus, the father of gods? Imagine being a child in such a world. From your very first breath, the air around you thick with prophecy, expectation, and suspicion. Imagine growing up knowing that every eye that looked upon you wondered, mortal prince or son of Olympus? It was not just Olympias who fueled these rumors. The culture of Greece thrived on heroes born of gods. Heracles, Perseus, Achilles, all said to be born from divine unions. For Alexander to rise as their equal or even surpass them, his story too needed the breath of divinity. And Olympias, clever and ambitious, was more than willing to fan that flame. As Alexander grew, the stories grew with him. His mother whispered of omens. Priests nodded knowingly when his name was mentioned. And the people, eager to believe, repeated the tale until it became part of his identity. But was Olympias speaking the truth of the gods, or was she weaving a net of belief to bind her son's future? Because while myths could crown him in the hearts of men, they also placed a dangerous distance between father and son. Philip, though proud, began to wonder if his heir was not truly his. And that suspicion would one day ignite fires of betrayal within the royal court. Pause for a moment. Imagine standing in Alexander's sandals. A boy whose every step was shadowed by gods, whose very existence was a riddle. Did he believe the stories himself? Did he wake at night, staring into the dark, wondering if Zeus truly watched over him? Or did he already know, even as a child, that myths were weapons sharper than spears? The line between legend and propaganda blurred from the very beginning. And it was in that blur that Alexander found his power. For when men believe you are chosen by gods, they will follow you to the ends of the earth. But before he became the conqueror who would stretch his hand from Greece to India, Alexander was still a boy, growing under the shadow of Philip II. A boy whose destiny was written in both myth and blood. And as we trace his path forward, we will see how the myth of his divine birth was not just a tale told by his mother, but a story that Alexander himself would wield masterfully as the sharpest tool in his rise to greatness. Yet destiny is never so simple. Because for every myth there is a rival truth. For every whisper of gods, there is the murmur of politics. And as Alexander approached manhood, he would be forced to prove, through fire, steel, and vision, whether his greatness came from Olympus, or from himself. And that test would begin with his education. For before he held a sword, Alexander was given something far more powerful, the mind of a philosopher. And the man who shaped that mind was Aristotle. But how did a young prince destined for war end up at the feet of one of the greatest thinkers in history? And more importantly, how would this knowledge feed the myth of his divine destiny? That answer awaits us as the journey continues. Part 2, The Philosopher and the Prince. Before the sword there was the scroll. Before the charge of armies, there was the whisper of ideas. And in the story of Alexander, nothing is more striking than the paradox of his youth. The boy who would conquer the world was raised not only by warriors but by philosophers. It was Philip II, the father he would one day rival in both glory and suspicion, who made a decision that would change history. He summoned Aristotle, the towering mind of the age, student of Plato, teacher of reason, logic, and science. In a move almost prophetic, the king entrusted his son not only with military training, but with the wisdom of philosophy. Imagine young Alexander, barely in his teens, walking into the sacred grove of Mysa where Aristotle would tutor him. The air heavy with the scent of olive trees, the sound of cicadas echoing through the Macedonian hills. And there, under the open sky, a boy destined to rule empires sat cross-legged before the man who had mapped the stars and dissected the essence of knowledge. Aristotle did not see in him just a prince, but perhaps the most promising mind of his time. He filled Alexander with Homer's verses, teaching him to see Achilles not as myth, but as mirror. Olympias had already whispered into Alexander's ear that Achilles was his ancestor. Now Aristotle gave those whispers flesh. He placed the Iliad in Alexander's hands, and the boy carried it with him all his life, even on campaigns. Some say he slept with it under his pillow, like a child with a sacred charm. But was it merely literature? Or was it a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled? Yet Aristotle's lessons were not only of glory. He taught ethics, logic, the importance of balance. He spoke of the golden mean, of moderation, of temperance. But can such ideas truly live in the heart of a boy who already believed himself born of Zeus? That is the tension. For even as reason filled his mind, the myth of his divine birth filled his soul. Think of the paradox. A youth instructed in the cold rationality of science, yet convinced, or at least told, that he was a child of the gods. Was Alexander torn between these worlds? Or did he learn the most valuable lesson of all, that both reason and myth could be used as weapons? Because make no mistake, Alexander's genius lay not only in his strategies of war, but in his strategies of belief. He understood, perhaps earlier than anyone else, that men march not only for gold or land, they march for meaning. And what greater meaning than to follow a man chosen by the heavens? As Aristotle lectured him on the order of the universe, Alexander must have listened with two ears. One as a student of truth, the other as a future king shaping the story of his destiny. He absorbed philosophy, but he never abandoned myth. Instead he married them. And in doing so he created something rare, a conqueror who could claim divine blood with his tongue, while commanding with the logic of a philosopher. But let us not forget, Alexander was not raised in cloisters of learning alone. The battlefield was his second classroom. Philip, a king hardened by wars, showed his son the brutality of power. By the time Alexander was 16, he was already commanding troops in his father's campaigns. He tasted victory young, leading men older than himself. And with every success, the whispers of his divine birth grew louder. After all, what mortal child could achieve such feats so early? Still, within the palace walls, the tension between father and son grew. Philip was a man of flesh and scars, proud of his son's brilliance, yet wary of the shadow of divinity cast upon him. Some say Philip doubted Olympias' stories, even mocked them. Others say he feared them. Because if Alexander truly was Zeus's son, what place did that leave for Philip, the earthly king? This tension exploded in moments of bitter conflict. At one feast, Philip, drunk and unsteady, insulted Alexander, questioning his legitimacy. Alexander spat back with fury, mocking his father's ability even to stand. That night, he stormed out with Olympias, seeking refuge away from Philip's court. And again the question burned: was Alexander Philip's heir, or Zeus's chosen? It is here that the myth begins to weave deeper into Alexander's own self-image. For when he looked at his father, he saw a great general, a builder of armies, a king. But when he looked at himself, he saw something greater, something untouchable. And that belief, whether born of truth or propaganda, became the core of his unshakable confidence. Pause for a moment. Imagine being his soldier years later, standing in the deserts of Persia, thirsty, exhausted, staring at a horizon of endless sand. And imagine your king riding before you, declaring that he is the son of Zeus-Ammon, destined to conquer the world. Would you not find new strength in your limbs? Would you not march forward, believing that to follow him was to follow destiny itself? This is what his youth under Aristotle, under Olympias, under Philip created. Not just a man but a myth. not just a prince but a living symbol. He learned how to think like a philosopher, fight like a warrior, and speak like a prophet. And when those three forces joined, the world itself would bow. But still, questions linger. Did Alexander truly believe he was divine? Or did he simply wield the myth as a king wields a scepter? And what role did the gods, or the belief in them, truly play in his rise? The answers to these questions would begin to unfold when Alexander, at just 20 years old, inherited his father's throne. For in that moment the boy became king. And the myths of his birth were no longer whispers in the palace. They became the foundation of his rule. Yet before he could prove his divine birthright to the world, he would first have to survive betrayal, assassination, and rebellion. His father's death left a throne dripping with blood, and only Alexander's strength, or perhaps his destiny, could secure it. So, as the next chapter unfolds, we will step into the moment where myth met reality. A 20-year-old king claiming the mantle of gods, staring down the chaos of his father's shattered kingdom. Would Alexander's supposed divine birth carry him through? Or would the mortal dangers of power destroy him before his legend could begin? The stage is set. The gods are watching. And the boy who claimed Olympus is about to be tested. Part 3, The King of Shadows and Destiny. History often pivots not on the stroke of a sword, but on the whisper of betrayal. And for Alexander, the path to kingship began not with glory but with blood. The night of Philip II's assassination remains shrouded in mystery. The king who had built Macedon into a formidable power was struck down during the celebration of his daughter's wedding. The assassin, a man named Pausanias, lunged with a blade, ending the life of the conqueror in an instant. But who truly orchestrated this act? Was it personal vengeance, as some claim? Or was it the invisible hand of Olympias, eager to clear the path for her son? Perhaps even Alexander himself stood in the shadows of that fatal moment, though history has never confirmed it. Yet one truth cannot be denied: the blood of Philip watered the throne, and into that chaos stepped his son Alexander. 20 years old. Barely a man by the reckoning of his time, yet already bearing the weight of a world that looked to him with suspicion, fear, and expectation. The throne was not secure. Enemies circled. Greek city-states whispered rebellion. The Macedonian nobles muttered that Alexander was too young, too untested. And within the palace, there were still those who doubted his lineage. Was he truly Philip's heir, or Zeus's son in disguise? This is where the myth of his divine birthright became more than a story. It became armor. Standing before his soldiers, Alexander invoked not only his father's legacy, but the gods themselves. He was not merely the son of Philip. He was the chosen one, the child foretold by omens, the bloodline of Achilles, the spark of Zeus. In a land where men bowed to destiny as much as to kings, this was no minor claim. It was the very thing that secured loyalty. For to doubt Alexander was to doubt the will of the gods. But kingship is never won by words alone. Alexander moved with ruthless precision. He struck down rivals at home, silenced dissent in the court, and reminded the Greek city-states that Macedon's power did not die with Philip. He marched south, sword in hand, and forced Athens, Thebes, and the others to acknowledge him as hegemon, the supreme leader of Greece. When Thebes dared to rebel, Alexander unleashed destruction so total that it shocked even his allies. The city was razed, its people slaughtered or enslaved. To some, it was cruelty. To Alexander, it was necessity. And more than that, it was a message. Those who defied him defied destiny itself. The myth of his divine birth gave meaning to the brutality. He was not just a king avenging rebellion. He was a God-born ruler cleansing the land of those who dared oppose fate. Pause and picture the scene. A young king standing before the smoking ruins of Thebes, his soldiers around him, his enemies trembling. The whispers in that moment grew louder. Who could stop such a man? Who could resist one marked by Olympus? And yet, Alexander was not content to rule Greece alone. His gaze stretched eastward toward the Persian Empire, the greatest power the world had ever known. It was here, against Darius III and the endless armies of Persia, that Alexander would prove, or disprove, his divine birthright. For in Greece, myth could be whispered and believed. But in Persia, among foreign peoples and rival kings, it would need to be shown in deeds that shook the earth. Before he left, Alexander visited Delphi, the sacred oracle of Apollo. There, it is said, the Pythia, the priestess of the god, refused to speak when he demanded prophecy. Enraged, Alexander dragged her by the arm until she cried out, "You are invincible, my son." To others it may have been a moment of violence, but to Alexander, it was divine confirmation. He was invincible. He was chosen. and he would carry that certainty into battle. This certainty was not only for himself but for his men. When soldiers march across deserts, when they bleed and suffer under endless campaigns, they need more than orders. They need belief. And Alexander gave it to them. He was their king, yes. But more than that, he was their bridge to Olympus. To follow him was not just to serve a ruler, it was to serve the god's design. And so the boy who had once listened to Aristotle beneath olive trees now stepped into the role of living legend. Armed with both philosophy and myth, he began the campaign that would reshape the world. But here lies the question that burns even now. Did Alexander truly believe he was divine, or did he simply master the art of belief? Because in the next chapter of his life, we see the myth grow beyond words. We see Alexander not only embrace his supposed divine lineage but confirm it, at least in the eyes of those who witnessed him, in the sands of Egypt, where the Oracle of Siwa would name him the son of Zeus-Ammon. And that moment would change everything. The boy born of dreams, raised by philosophy, crowned by blood, would now be declared a god on earth. But what did that mean for him, for his men, for his enemies? And what dangers came with claiming a place among the gods? Part 4, the God King emerges. The Persian Empire stretched like a colossus across the ancient world. Its cities gleamed with wealth. Its armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. To conquer it seemed impossible, unless you believed yourself born of gods. And Alexander did. At the banks of the Granicus River, at Issus, and finally at Gaugamela, Alexander faced Darius III, the King of Kings. Each battle tested not only his strategy but the strength of his myth. Soldiers fought harder, pushed further, endured more because they believed they marched under a man chosen by Olympus. And time after time, Alexander's brilliance, and perhaps his destiny, brought victory. But victory alone was not enough. If Alexander was to claim more than land, if he was to command the loyalty of people beyond Greece, he needed more than the sword. He needed divine recognition that transcended borders. And so, after breaking Persia's power, Alexander turned south to Egypt, a land steeped in gods older than Greece itself. When he entered, the people welcomed him not as conqueror but as liberator. They saw in him not a foreign invader, but a ruler blessed by heaven. Yet even that was not enough for Alexander. He wanted confirmation, undeniable and eternal. He journeyed into the Libyan desert to the Oracle of Siwa, a place shrouded in mystery where the god Ammon was worshipped. The trek itself was a trial, endless sands, searing sun, men collapsing in the heat. Legend says that as Alexander's party staggered forward, they were saved by divine signs. Crows guiding their path, sudden rains falling to quench their thirst. The soldiers whispered that even the desert bent to their king's will. Finally, at the sanctuary of Siwa, Alexander entered alone to face the oracle. What passed between the young conqueror and the priest remains a secret sealed by time. But when he emerged, the whispers spread like fire. The oracle had declared him the son of Zeus-Ammon. Pause here. Imagine the weight of those words. Not merely king. Not merely conqueror. But son of Zeus. A living god. Did Alexander believe it? Perhaps. Did he use it? Absolutely. For in that moment, his myth became more than a story told by Olympias. It became a proclamation stamped by the gods themselves. And for his men, his followers, his subjects, it was proof that their faith had never been in vain. From that day forward, Alexander leaned deeper into the role of God King. He demanded honors not just as a ruler but as divine. Some embraced it, kneeling before him. Others, especially his Macedonian generals, proud men of hardened traditions, grumbled. Was their leader still a king, or had he crossed the dangerous line into hubris? But Alexander understood what they did not. For in Persia and Egypt, kingship was inseparable from divinity. To rule, one had to be more than human. By embracing the mantle of son of Zeus-Ammon, Alexander was not rejecting his Macedonian roots. He was becoming a universal ruler, one who could stand above nations, above tribes, above all divisions. Still, the myth came at a price. The more Alexander claimed godhood, the more distance grew between him and those who had once marched beside him as equals. His generals began to whisper. His soldiers began to question. Was their king still a man, or had he lost himself in the illusion of divinity? Yet Alexander pressed on. His campaigns swept further east into Babylon, into Persia's heart and beyond. Each victory confirmed his aura of invincibility. Each city that fell before him seemed to testify that the gods walked at his side. And yet, the more he conquered, the more he seemed to chase something greater than empire. Perhaps it was not enough to rule the world. Perhaps Alexander sought to prove that he was not just born of gods, but destined to become one himself. And so, the myth of his divine birthright, once a whisper in Olympias's chamber, now thundered across continents. It had become both his crown and his chain, lifting him above all men, yet isolating him from them. But destiny has its shadows. And as Alexander pushed further into the unknown, cracks began to appear. His men grew weary. His court grew divided. The question of his divinity, once a source of unity, now threatened to tear his empire apart. And in those final years as he marched toward India, the question of whether he was truly God-born or simply God-hungry became sharper than ever. Because if Alexander was truly divine, no mortal could stop him. But if he was only human, then his hubris would be his undoing. And soon the world would learn the answer. Part 5. The Mortal End of a God. The march into India was not the march of mortals. It was the march of a man chasing infinity. By the time Alexander's army reached the Indus River, they had already crossed mountains, deserts, and the ruins of empires. They had seen wonders most Greeks could barely imagine. Yet Alexander pressed on, driven by something more than conquest. It was as though he sought to touch the edge of the world itself, to prove once and for all that his destiny was not bound by men, but ordained by gods. In India he faced not just armies but legends. At the Battle of the Hydaspes he confronted King Porus, a ruler whose elephants towered over the battlefield like moving fortresses. The clash was brutal, mud and blood mixing under monsoon rains. Many of Alexander's men feared that for once, their god-born leader had met his match. But again the impossible happened. Alexander triumphed, and in a gesture that echoed his own growing god complex, he spared Porus and restored him as king, claiming magnanimity befitting not just a conqueror but a deity. Yet here in the heart of India the cracks widened. His men, exhausted, broken by endless campaigns, began to resist. When Alexander demanded to march further east, toward lands no Greek had ever seen, they refused. For the first time his aura of divinity faltered. His soldiers reminded him that they were men of flesh, not gods of Olympus. And in that refusal something shifted. Alexander, the son of Zeus-Ammon, the invincible, was forced to turn back. The myth still shone brightly, but now it carried a shadow. Even a god-king, it seemed, had limits. The return march was grueling, through deserts that claimed thousands of lives. Whispers began to grow louder. Was Alexander truly favored by the gods, or had his hubris brought divine punishment upon them all? Then came Babylon. The city welcomed him as a king, but within its walls awaited his fate. At only 32 years old, Alexander fell ill, some say from fever, others from poison, still others from the wrath of gods he had dared to rival. For days he lay in his palace, unable to speak, unable to move as his generals watched in silence. And then, the man who had never been defeated in battle, who had marched farther than any king before him, who had been hailed as the son of Zeus, breathed his last. The world reeled. How could a god die? How could the son of Zeus fall to sickness like any mortal? Some clung to the myth, insisting that Alexander had not died at all, that he had ascended, like Heracles, into Olympus. Others wept, realizing that their god-king was flesh after all. And here lies the riddle that has haunted history for centuries. Was Alexander truly divine, born of Zeus as Olympias claimed, confirmed by the Oracle at Siwa? Or was it all the greatest act of propaganda the ancient world had ever seen? A myth carefully woven by mother, king and conqueror to bind men's hearts and fuel an empire? The truth may never be known. But what cannot be denied is the power of belief. Whether or not Alexander was truly divine mattered less than the fact that millions believed he was. That belief carried him across deserts, through empires, into the pages of eternity. Even in death the myth lived on. His generals carved up his empire, but each sought to inherit a fragment of his divine aura. His legend spread to Rome, to Persia, to India, shaping the dreams of rulers for centuries. And today when we speak his name, we do not simply remember a man, we remember the echo of a god. So, was Alexander the Great truly born of Olympus, or was he a master of illusion, wielding myth as skillfully as he wielded the sword? Perhaps the answer lies not in the heavens but in us. For as long as we believe, the myth endures. And maybe that is Alexander's true divinity. Not in blood, not in birthright, but in the immortal power of a story that refuses to die. So now I leave you with a question. Was Alexander's greatness written in the stars, or written by his own hand? The answer perhaps depends on whether you believe in gods, or in men who make themselves gods.